We're going to continue in Psalm 78. Couldn't remember exactly where we stopped last Wednesday, but I think somewhere around verse 39. Just to recap very briefly, so we'll be able to get through tonight. Of course, this is a historical psalm. It's a psalm about teaching that next generation, how important that is. And as we went through this and seen last Wednesday evening about the importance of not only teaching that next generation the love of God and the graciousness of God and the goodness of God that we're seeing through this, but also His graciousness and goodness even with the sins that Israel did. But you're also seeing God's severe instructions toward them and the consequences for the things in which they did. And as we went through and as we seen this, I want us to look back at verse 32, if we could, just for a moment, and read just a few of these. He said, "In spite of this, they still sinned, and did not believe His wondrous works. Therefore their days He consumed in futility, and their years in fear. When He slew them, they sought Him, and they returned, and sought earnestly for God. Then they remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God, their Redeemer. Nevertheless, they flattered Him with their mouth. They lied to Him with their tongue, for their heart was not steadfast with Him, nor were they faithful in His covenant. But He, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and did not destroy them." You know, I think that's a very powerful part of this psalm. And there's a couple things that we've seen with this psalm so far is that how God's anger was provoked and how He was furious with them. And why was He so furious? Why do you think He was so furious with Israel during this time? From the things that we've seen from this psalm. You know, they asked Him, basically, could God build a feast for Him, a table in the wilderness? Can you give us water? Can you give us food? Can you give us a different kind of food? And it says it gave it what they desired. It wasn't that they just wanted a full belly. He gave them what they desired. What they desired was their self-will, what they wanted. And He gave it to them, and they still wasn't happy with that. They still were upset. They still rebelled. And it said He was furious at them. Think about that. Think about exactly what they were doing to make God furious. Yeah, they repeated the same thing over and over. It was they were discontent, I guess. They were not satisfied. They didn't trust Him. Now, we're not talking about murder, are we? We're not talking about, as we can go through a list of what we would call grievous sins. What made God furious was them not trusting Him over and over again. They just complained and complained and complained. They were doing things that we don't really consider grievous sins. But to God it was. If you look what God was trying to do and was doing and still doing with us today, how He wants us to serve Him. He wants us to be obedient to Him. But what is it that how is it that we actually follow Him? Do we constantly complain? Are we not satisfied with anything? Or what are we truly wanting? If we're asking God something and we want Him to give us our desire, what is our desire? It says He gave them their desire here, but it was to serve themselves. Oh, can you do this for us? Can you do this for us? Can you do this for us? And it says here that they only remembered God was their rock and the Most High. They only returned to Him and they sought Him. They only remembered Him, but then they flattered Him with their mouths. Did they really turn back to Him? You think about this whole process of Him bringing them through out of Egypt, bringing them in the wilderness, and then how He dealt with that generation of disobedience that they weren't going to enter into the promised land. And then when the ones that did enter in the promised land, we're going to see now in the rest of the psalm what they actually did. Did they truly turn back to Him, or what did they do? They actually turned to idols. So you see, as this whole process is going through, as God is training this nation, He's also going to end up pruning this nation down to exactly what He wants. Exactly those that truly want to serve Him. And this process is pretty, it's not very good. But I think what is good through this whole thing, God remembered that man is flesh. God remembered that man is not perfect. God remembered how we are. Doesn't excuse it, but He still remembered how we are. And I think what's interesting about this psalm is that this psalmist here remembers, and in far as that teaching that next generation, remember we talked about last week, it's not just the next generation, it's teaching the next generation to teach that next generation, to teach that next generation and the next generation. That's what we have to be doing. And in doing this, he not only talked about the love of God and God's graciousness, but also talked about Israel's sins, was open about it. Do you think that's what we need to be teaching that next generation? Here's what happened. Here's what we've done that was right, but here's what we've done that was wrong. Here's how I didn't live as I should live. Here's how I didn't do the things that I should do. Here was the consequence of that. And here's what could be the consequence if that continues to be. You know, I think that's a very important part of teaching. But let's start here in verse 40. Notice what he says. He says, as he's finished in verse 39, says, He remembered that they were but flesh, a breath that passes away and does not come again. How often they provoked Him in the wilderness and grieved Him in the desert. Yes, again and again they tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember His power, the day when He redeemed them from the enemy, when He worked His signs in Egypt. Now let's just stop here just for a second before he gets in, and he's going to talk about all He did for them in Egypt, all the things that they've seen. Notice what the psalmist says here, that they continued to provoke Him in the wilderness, in the desert, and limited the Holy One of Israel. Do you think it's possible to limit God? I mean, can the creation limit the Creator? Yeah. What do you think? How do you think they did that here? Notice what God does. Yeah, God can do anything, but notice how God has, and I want to make sure I say this right, God has tied His what He does for us to our obedience and our faith, hasn't He? He says, okay, here's what I want you to do, here's what I command you to do, and here's what I'm going to do for you because I love you. I'm going to give you these instructions to do this. And if you do those instructions, then you're going to be blessed. You're going to be blessed if you do these things. But what if I don't do those things? Am I going to be blessed? I'm not going to be blessed. So do I limit God in that sense? Isn't that what Israel did? That they limit Him. You know, God is wanting to do all of these things for them. God is loving them. It's just like a parent with their children. We want to do all that we can for them, but they can limit what we can do by their actions, can't they? And that's exactly what Israel was doing here. And that's what, as he started out about teaching that next generation and that next generation to understand this. If you want these blessings, I can't think of it. I think it's Matthew 13. I don't know the exact verse, Blake. Wasn't it where Jesus said that He didn't, in Nazareth, He didn't do many works before them because of their unbelief? Well, did they miss out on some blessings because of their unbelief? Did they limit Him because of it? Yeah, they did. That's what the psalmist is talking about here. There's things, and as I was reading and studying this throughout the weeks, I've thought about this. How many blessings have I missed out on? How have I limited God by my actions or by my lack of them? It's kind of sobering to think about, isn't it? You know, God wants us to, John 10:10, I came to give you life and give it to you more abundantly. He wants us to have an abundant life, but I very well may miss out on an abundant life here because of what I'm not doing that He wants me to do. You know, all Israel so far here was worried about how we're going to eat, what we're going to drink. How come you brought us back? We had it so good over here. Why did you do? You know, it's all this. So God continues to give them these things, But what they didn't realize, He could give them so much more than what they think they actually desire. Because what they're desiring is, I want this and I want it now. I want this and I want this. Well, He provided it for them, but they weren't happy, were they? No. But they got exactly what they were desiring. Their self-will. I want this, God, and that's what He gave them. I want this, God, and that's what He gave them. But they still were not content with that. So they're actually limiting Him on what He actually wants to do for them. And if all they would do is trust Him, so now we're at the point to where He brings them out of Egypt, and that's what we're going to see here, all this that He did for them in Egypt, and we see how that generation behaved and acted even despite all that God had done. And then we're going to see even when they get over to Canaan now how He's clearing the way for them, but still how they do there. So, all this that God is wanting to do and can do, they're not letting Him do it by the actions in which they're doing. But He goes on, it says, verse 43, when He worked His signs in Egypt and His wonder in the field of Zoan, turned their rivers into blood, their streams they could not drink. He sent swarms of flies among them which devoured them, and the frogs which destroyed them. He also gave their crops to the caterpillar, and they labored to the locusts. And their labor to the locusts. He destroyed their vines with hail, their sycamore trees with frost. He gave up their cattle to the hail, their flocks to fiery lightning. He cast on them in the fierceness of His anger, wrath, indignation, and trouble, by sending angels of destruction among them. He made a path for His anger. He did not spare their soul from death, but gave their life over to the plague, and destroyed all the firstborn in Egypt, the first of their strength in the tents of Ham. But He made His own people go forth like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And He led them on safely, so they did not fear, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And He brought them to His holy border, this mountain which His right hand had acquired. He also drove out the nations before them, allotted them an inheritance by survey, and made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. So we see all this, and of course we know that all of this is all the things He did in Egypt was against their deities that they served, and brought that out. And the last one was their firstborn. You think about all the things that they... And I think it's interesting. This isn't the first time that a psalmist has mentioned Egypt and what God had done. And I think that's interesting. I think it's almost like if we go back to some great event, what do we go back to? What's a great event we go back to that God's done for us, that we see His power?
Something happened good.
His what?
Something good happened to it.
Yeah, Jesus dying on the cross. I mean, and rising again. That's as Paul said, that's what our faith is hinged on, right? I think for them, they always look back to this. Every time they talk about a great event of power that God's shown, it can always go back to what He did for Egypt, through the children with Egypt. But you look at this great event, just like you look today at us looking at the cross. How appreciative and grateful were they for that? Were they really? How appreciative are we today for what Jesus did, dying on the cross for us? We still complain about things. We still aren't content with a lot of things. We still, you think that cycle is just continuing, seems like. And I think that's what the psalmist was trying to get across, especially what we learned last week, is we've got to make sure we're teaching this generation, here's the goodness of God, but here's how your forefathers acted. Here's what they did. And this is how it turned out for them. Don't repeat that. Don't do that.
Yeah. God's people, but you also have to teach them, it's once you get into the wilderness, the farther you get away from that's easier to forget. At our baptism, we're on fire for Jesus, we're right at the foot of the cross, but the farther away we get from that, the easier it is to do what they did, to lose your thankfulness.
Absolutely. Think about it. I read something when I was looking at this. One writer said, it's just like iron. When iron is in the fire, it's malleable, isn't it? It's fine. But what happens when it gets out of the fire? It gets hard again, doesn't it? So as we see what these individuals did, it says they only came back to God when He slew them. So yeah, when God is slewing them, when they're going through that hard time, we're going to change. We're going to change. We're all for you, God. We're right here. But what happens when they go farther? You know, what happens now? They get a little farther from that event. They turn back to what they were. It says they are just honoring Him with their mouth and their lips, but they're not really following Him. They're saying they're going to, but they're not really doing it. They just kind of going through the motions, whatever got them out of trouble to begin with. But once they get back in trouble again, then they want to call on God again. And that's what the pattern seems to continue to be. Well, you see it all through the book of Judges, don't you? It's up, God sends them a judge, they follow him for a while, then what happens? It goes back down, it goes up. And as John's preached several times, they never get back up to that mark, do they? Just go a little bit back. Why? Because it's that next generation that's coming, that next one, and it's getting a little farther and a little farther away. I believe that's what the psalmist is getting across here. Asaph, he's saying, don't let it be that. He's remembering back. Look at all the things that God did. That's what we need to be teaching that next generation, to teach that next generation. But in part of doing that, what mistakes were made? What caused God to do this? What caused God to keep a generation of them in the wilderness? What caused all their problems once they got into Canaan? Even after they seen all that happened in Egypt, even they seen how God took care of them in the wilderness, why did they still continue to not trust God? What else? Really, what else? It almost reminds me of the day, gets me to think about the day of judgment. When I stand before God on the day of judgment, I always try to put myself in that position a lot when I'm thinking about things. If I'm found not to have served Him, if I found not to be faithful like He wants me to, what possible excuse could I give? You didn't do enough? You didn't do enough for me to be faithful to you, God. He gave me His word, 1 Timothy 3:16, didn't He? It's everything to make, I'm not complete, but it makes me complete, doesn't it? He's gave me that. His Son died for me. What really more could He have done? You think about the children of Israel here, what more could He have done for them? He's doing, they cried out to Him for some 400 years, didn't they? God delivered them out of that. How the taskmaster was, and the first thing once they get out there, they're like, boy, them melons and things sure were good in Egypt. Boy, we have a big time in Egypt. Did they really? Was it easy making bricks with what they had and what they took away from them? Well, of course it wasn't. It was a hard life. But once they got out of that and they were faced another trial, I think it's always that unknown. It's always that, okay, it's different, and it makes us uneasy, doesn't it? Sometimes different makes it uneasy for us. I think it's like that transition out of sin into the body of Christ. All the things that we do, sometimes we still think back and think, okay, it's difficult here. I was comfortable here. We thought we were, wasn't we? We thought we were comfortable in the darkness. We thought we were comfortable with how things were because we got used to it. Now things are hard out here. Now we're out here, we're exposed, we're in the light, we're seeing it for what it truly is. And it's hard. It's scary. And what happens? We want to resort back to what we know. And when we resort back to what we know, what is it? Well, I was really happy like it used to be. Were you really? Well, of course not. But that's what we seem to think, and that's what they thought here. But he goes through and he reminds them of all the things in which God did. But notice starting here now in verse 56. He said, "Yet they tested and provoked the Most High God, did not keep His testimonies, but turned back and acted unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow, for they provoked Him to anger with their high places, moved Him to jealousy with their carved images. When God heard this, He was furious and greatly abhorred Israel." Now let's stop there just for a minute. Again, God was furious. Okay, you got the generation that He said, okay, because this is what you did, you're not going to enter in the promised land. So you got this group that come from Egypt to the desert. That's where they were going to stay because what they did. Now you've got the next generation that goes over into the promised land, and what did they do there? They started worshiping idols in the high places. It says they turned aside like a deceitful bow. In other words, I mean, just think about having a bow and getting ready into battle, get ready to do it, and that bow malfunctions. Is it much use to you? How devastating is that? Well, that's what these people were to God. God had everything prepared for them. He's clearing a way for them into the promised land because it's exactly what He told Abraham it was going to be back in Genesis. So when they get there, what do? They start acting like them. They start doing what, again, kind of reverting back to what's comfortable. Well, it's a lot easier to, we talked about this before when it come to them not driving out. As a matter of fact, I think one passage even talks about how they said they couldn't do it. Can you imagine that? I can't do what God said I could do? Well, of course they could have. They didn't want to. They didn't try. They didn't do what God wanted them to do, so now they've started worshiping idols. So how do you go from seeing all these signs and wonders that God did to worshiping an idol? How do you do that? Pressure from what's around you? The crowd that's around you? Why do you think God wanted them to completely drive them out to begin with? Wouldn't be an influence. And yet they didn't drive them out, and what were they? They were an influence, wouldn't they? And notice it says here, and moved him to jealousy with their carved images. When God heard this, He was furious and greatly abhorred Israel. Furious. Now, I don't know about you, if Scripture was to say God was furious with me, I don't think I'd like that very much, would you? I think that's some pretty harsh words. What does it take? Why do you think God's so furious here? What is it they're doing wrong? And here is the process. If you look at that process, just like James says sin is. If you look at the process of what they did, when you don't trust God, what does that cause you to do? Cause you a little bit more to get away from Him, right? I know what's best for me. I don't trust you. I know what's best. Here's what my desire is. Okay, you said I should drive all these out. I think it'd be better if I don't. Well, I think it'd be better now if I start worshiping like they do and just kind of blend in and just being part of them now. So it all starts with a lack of trust of God, which He was trying to teach them in the wilderness. Now it comes out to full rebellion and worshiping idols. So yes, it would make God mad, wouldn't it? He's a jealous God. He doesn't want them to serve anybody else but Him. And look at all that He did. I mean, think about it. There's really nothing else God could have done. I don't know of anything He could have done. He gave them what they needed. He gave them what they wanted. He showed them all these things in Israel, in Egypt, of how powerful He was. But yet, look where they ended up. So you got a generation that didn't get to enter in. Now the generation that did, now there's going to be some dividing with that because of how they're acting and the things in which they're doing. Look at verse 60. It says, he abhorred Israel so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had placed among men, and delivered his strength into captivity and his glory into the enemy's hands. He also gave his people over to the sword and was furious with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men. Their maidens were not given in marriage. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. So if you see all these things that were taking place, you can go to 1 Samuel 4. You remember when you have here Eli's daughter-in-law, when she realized that her husband, her brother-in-law, her father-in-law, and 30,000 fell. You remember that? Then what happened? She was pregnant. When she heard that news, what happened? She died in labor, but she gave her child a name, Ichabod, which meant glory has departed. That's where they've ended up. You know, you've got them, again, coming in ransacking. They're taking the Ark of the Covenant. All of this is taking place, and the psalmist here is remembering back this. Okay, it started in Egypt where God delivered His people, then yet they complained, they wasn't content. They tested God over and over again, so that generation didn't get to enter in. Then you got the next generation that did enter in, but then they started worshiping idols, so God gives them over to the sword. Then you start seeing all this destruction that's taking place. Why wouldn't you think that glory is departed? Well, of course you would. You know, it's just like Asaph just thinking when the temple was ransacked there, when the Babylonians came and took over, you know, just thinking, this has to be the end. Can you imagine getting in that situation? So as you start putting this together, it kind of gives you a timeline, I think, of how the process of disobedience is. It doesn't just start overnight to, well, I'm just not going to believe in God. It's about not trusting Him and not giving up our will. We want to do things our way. We want it our way. And then when we call on God, we're just calling on Him to say, okay, God, give it to us this way. This is what we want. And then when God even gives it to us, we're not satisfied. It's like Paul said about giving them over to a delusional mind, a disobeyed mind. You know, just they're going to go down that path, so I'm going to let them go down that path. You think this is the right path to go? Then you're going to go down this path and you're going to see what the end is. And that end is not going to be something that's very, very pretty. And we see that here as they're going through this. Look in verse 62. He also gave His people over to the sword and was furious with His inheritance. The fire consumed their young men. Their maidens were not given into marriage. Their priests fell by the sword. There was a widow's maid, no lamentation. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, like a mighty man with shouts because of wine, and He beat back His enemies. He put them to a perpetual reproach. So even in the midst of all of this, even when they come and they took the ark, and even in the midst of all this destruction, they're still going to see the glory of God. They're still going to see what He can do. They're still going to see what His power is. But yet think about all the things that they didn't have to go through, did they? They didn't have to face that. They didn't have to. Yeah, God still loved them through this. God still wanted them to do right, but God's long suffering is only going to go so far. And there has to be, even with God's compassion, even with His love, there were still consequences for their actions. There had to be consequences, didn't they? I mean, it had to be that way for God to accomplish what He's going to accomplish. And it's the same with us. There's things that God wants us to accomplish. We may not fulfill that. God's still going to fulfill what He's going to do, but maybe I'm not going to be a part of it now. Maybe I'm not going to get the blessing from it because of how I've done or what I've said or how I've acted during the process. And it's a pretty hard reality, I think, to see. But then he goes on. He says, moreover, he rejected the intent of Joseph and did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved, and he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he has established forever. He also chose David his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds, from following the ewes that had young he had brought him, to the shepherd Jacob his people, and Israel his inheritance. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. So let's back up here and put all this in perspective. So you have all of this, all of Israel coming out of Egypt. You have this generation that's in the wilderness that's not obeying God. They're not content with what's going on. They're not serving Him. They're not trusting Him. So because of that, now we're not talking murderous people. We're not talking, all these as we think of these most evil sins. These people didn't enter the promised land simply because they didn't trust and obey God. And pretty well that simple, wouldn't it? Then you have the generation that did, and you see all this. So you've got still this nation that God is doing, and you think, and he talks about Ephraim here, and Ephraim is used, I think, as a whole, a lot of times talking about the disobedience for Israel. But you've got, as it gets narrowed down, how it comes to Judah. And then he shows Judah. Then you would think that he would choose this king that the people wanted, but it comes down to David. So you see, God is going to get and do what He knows is necessary to do. It may not look like we think it should look like. It may not end up like we think it should end up, but it's going to be exactly what God says. And it talks about how David served them just as God said that He would. And He served him out of his heart and the skillfulness in which that He did. But let's think about this as far as a whole of what, as Asaph started from the beginning about teaching. If you were to set your kids down and you were to tell them exactly what Asaph did here, okay, this is what God did. This is what your grandpa, your great-grandpa's generation, this is what they did. How would you what if you was that kid, what if you heard that? How would that make you feel? You start looking at individuals that, you look at the Jews, the ones during Jesus' time. What was their go-to phrase? We're children of Abraham. We're children of Abraham. Remember what John told them? God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones. The axe is to the root. He's about to cut it off. You talk about lineage. This is the lineage. This is what your forefathers did. This is how they acted. Now you tell me how the ones in Jesus' time acted any different. You tell us how many people today act any different. So what are we going to go back on? What are we going to say? What have we learned, good and bad, from previous generations? A lot of good. But there could be some bad too. What's the next generation going to learn from us? What are they going to look at, and what are we going to say, okay, here's what we did right, but here's what we did wrong too. That means we'd have to be honest first with ourselves, but two, with that generation. I think that's that's not an easy thing to do. I've had to do that as a parent, be honest with your children and say, hey, I didn't do this right. I didn't do this right. That's a pretty powerful pill to swallow. But look, even in the New Testament, Paul even talks about this, of how it goes back to these same events. Even those that crossed over, come out of Egypt didn't do what they're supposed to do. And I think the whole purpose of that is when we come up out of that water, when we're committed to fully obeying God and we start our Christian walk, we've got to make sure we start it with the attitude of, okay, did I deserve this? What did it take to get me here? Just like he told some of them, here you're reaping the benefits of what your forefathers did. You're living in houses you didn't build. You're doing things that you didn't do, but here, he had that conversation with them. It's the same thing. What are we looking at when it comes to that next generation? What are we looking at in our Christian life? Are we ready to face the things that we faced? When I say I'm committed to God, I'm fully committed to trusting in Him. I'm fully committed to doing what He says to do, not just fall back and and just sit in the pews and say, well, I'm so-and-so's grandson, so I'm good. My grandma and grandpa were faithful, and they may have been, but what does that say about me? Again, when I stand before God on the day of judgment, what excuse can I give?
He basically showed us the topic that we should have.
Yeah.
And then it comes down to personal choice, just like you said.
Yeah.
You choose.
Yeah. Well, just like he said, choose this day whom you will serve. And I think that's a good lesson, because sometimes we think, it's kind of on the flip side too, okay, like Mike said, here's what your forefathers did. And it's just like and I had this conversation with a young man. I guess I've had this conversation with him several times. Okay, here's what you seen that your dad did, or here's what you seen that your family is doing. You choose. You get to choose who you're going to be. You're choosing, okay, you can either choose to do right, or you can choose to follow in that same footsteps. And I think that's the same thing that Joseph was telling them. That's the same way the Scripture tells us over and over again. Look at the past. Look and see what they did, right and wrong, and you choose who you're going to serve. And you choose how you're going to serve them. And I think that's what it, boils down to. And that's a choice we all have to make. Bill?
We have to remember that they had a choice to make. Each generation had a choice to make. So the young people today, even though they come to church, as we say, or class, after that high school education is gone, then that's when they need to really make some serious consideration of how they're going to live.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I tell you, that's why I'm enjoying the teenage class on Sunday morning. And believe me, they've asked some tough questions. That we've been dealing with some tough things. But one thing is, we've been talking through that, and I told him, I said, here's why I like that. Is because you're at the age where your faith has to be your faith. It can't be, I'm doing it just because mom and daddy did it. I do it just because my grandparents did it, or I do it because this is what I'm supposed to do. It's got to be your faith. So you need to know, this is why I'm doing this. This is why I'm serving God this way. This is why I'm faithful this way. This is why I don't do these things. This is why I do these things. It's because that's what faith is. And it's got to be me making that decision to follow that faith, not someone else making that decision for me. And you need all the facts when you do that. So don't be afraid to question that. Don't be afraid to say, okay, why am I doing it this way? Or why am I not doing it this way? Or, okay, then, just like he was teaching here, here's what I've seen others do. That's maybe not be the way I should be doing that. That may be why. That's why you have denominations and things, because somebody's following somebody else and not searching the Scriptures. You look again. I can go back to the Berean brethren. Remember that they searched the Scripture daily to see if these things are so. What things? The things that Apostle Paul was telling them. He was an apostle, and they didn't take his word for it. So we've got to make sure that we're choosing the faith, because when you choose it yourself and not do like some of these did, we're children of Abraham. Where just like it says, that's not what God is wanting. God is wanting you, whosoever will. And that whosoever will is me making that choice that I will.
I was going to say, I think about this as a dad with young kids. You can't make a decision for your kids, but the way that you live your life at home, the way that you parent, is going to greatly affect the decision that they make. And I want to parent, because I think a lot of kids in the church, like we said, they float away after high school. And that's almost they just float away. But the way that I parent in my mind, I want my kids to know, look, in our family, we serve God. You don't have to choose to serve God, but you're going to know that you made that choice. You're not going to float away. If you make that choice, I'm going to make sure that you know that you've made that choice, because the de facto is going to be, God has blessed us, we're God's people, this is what we're going to be. And so I think that more parents, especially young parents, need to parent in such a way that their kids know there's a decision being made. You're making a decision. You're making a choice.
And I think that's the key as a parent, and I think I learned this too late sometimes and didn't always think of it this way, is, I've got a responsibility to train my children to make sure of how to make that choice. I may not can make that choice for them when they grow up, but I think it's my job to teach them to make that choice, to make a choice, and understand what the rewards and consequences for those choices are. So go back and read this. There's a lot. We could have spent weeks on Psalm 78. Bert?
I think one of the things
So, we have a responsibility, not only to ourselves, but we have a responsibility to teach our people that we know, that have not been there.
Yeah, and what do you think Paul even stressed so much? You know, older women teach the younger women, older men teach these younger men. It's not just parents, it's a generation that's teaching that next generation to be able to do that.